Hey, welcome to another video from windy, rainy South Florida. In this one, I'd like to talk briefly about the Voigtlander 75mm f1.5 lens for the Z system. I tried it out with a Nikon Z8. Now, the reason why I say my impression of rather than a review is because there are people that will go in far more in depth than I will concerning a lens. People like Dustin Abbott or Rishi Talks, they really do reviews. I'm more, hey, I've been using the lens for a couple of weeks. Here's some of the images I took. This is the impression that it gives me. Let me start by saying that I am a huge fan of Voigtlander lenses. This is the fourth one that I've owned. I owned the 58-14 and the 40 F2 for the F-mount system that I've sold when I went to the Z system. I now have the 50 F2 Apo, which I've spoken about several times on this channel. And now I have the 75-15. I'm still debating on whether I'm going to keep it or not. Probably will. First impressions are all Voigtlander lenses are just made beautifully. It's well crafted. The aperture stops, the clicks on the aperture ring to go to one stop from, let's say, f4 to 5.6. There's 3 clicks, so you have 1/3 stops, which is very nice. For people that are afraid of manual focus lenses, there's ways around it. I mean, I miss shots with autofocus lenses. But with manual focus lenses, one thing I do is with the Nikon system, I turn on what's called focus peaking. I'm not sure what it's called on a Canon or a Sony. I'm sure it's something similar. But it will then have little dancing ants on your screen. It'll tell you what's in focus and what's not. So I turn that on, and the other thing I do is I've assigned one of my buttons, one of my function buttons, so that when I hit it, it automatically zooms into 100%. And so let's say I'm focusing on someone's eye, I can really fine tune it. And that's how it helps you a little bit with a manual focus lens. But it's not as difficult as what you think, especially if you practice a little bit. So the fact that it's a manual focus lens doesn't really throw me off, at least me personally. It balances fairly well on a Z8. I will admit that the 85-18, which is, it's a Nikon lens, is designed for the Nikon bodies. It balances a little bit better, but it's not a deal killer. It just feels a little top heavy compared to some of the Nikon lenses, but again, it's barely noticeable, but it is there, in my opinion. One of the reasons why I like the Voigtlander lenses is because the colors and the skin tones that come out of the majority of their lenses is just fantastic. We're going to go to the computer in a minute and I'll show you. Even at f1.5 wide open, you can get some pretty sharp images. But overall, my first impressions are, it's an excellent lens. It falls right in line with the other Voigtlanders. All right, so let's go to the computer and take a look at some of the images. Here's the first image that I took with it. This was wide open at 1.5. Now I did make a little bit of an adjustment to the exposure and the sharpness, but that's right here on my desk with a side light, obviously. But you can see the fall off that comes at 1.5, a nice little creamy effect. It's very nice. Here's a couple of shots from the newspaper print. Again, at f1.5, you have a nice fall off. And then when you get to f4, you can see a better contrast in the lens. At f1.5, you get an okay bit of contrast, but once you start to stop down the lens a little bit, the contrast is much better. Here's another one at f1.5. Look at the colors even at f1.5 and how sharp it is at the Z and the 8 and the fall off. And then just going to f2.8, you do get more contrast. Obviously you get more sharpness, and I think the colors may be a hair better once you start stopping down the lens. But either way, it's beautiful even at 1.5. One more example of f1.5 to f2.8. You can see an increase in the contrast and obviously the sharpness in the dead flower, especially the one to the far right, and maybe a little bit to the pink rose up top. However, even at f1.5, it's still pretty sharp. But I think if I were to use this lens consistently, it would probably be at least f2, but it is definitely very usable at f1.5, and I'm going to prove it to you right now. Take a look at this photo of the squirrel on a tree, and yes, there was a little bit of purple fringing in that tree that I took out, but that was about the only adjustment I made. Now look at it at 100% blown up. This is at f1.5. Look how creamy that background is. Look at the hair on that squirrel, and look at his eyeball. I mean, at f1.5 from that distance, pretty darn good. Here's one that I took outside when it was pretty windy out. Wide open at f1.5, and yes, I did make a little bit of adjustment to the texture, but I did leave the color exactly the way it was straight out of camera. And remember, this is manually focusing, and it was very windy outside. But just look at the colors and look how creamy that background is and how nice that fall off is. I realize that this is supposed to really be a portrait lens, but you can do a lot of things with it. I know it's not designed to be a macro lens, but here's a shot of a moth on, essentially it's just a weed out on the fence on my carport area. So in the back you can see the lines from the fence, but that's straight out of camera. I didn't touch a thing. And here it is at f2 with just a little bit of processing, not a whole lot. And look how beautiful that background is. Even at f2, look how sharp that moth is. And this is not a macro lens, but look at the colors. I didn't touch the colors. I just touched the texture and the contrast, maybe just a hair, and that was it. And look how beautiful that is. This is my neighbor's dog, Howard. He's not doing so well right now, so I wanted to take a image for my neighbor. This was at f2.8. I made it into a black and white, and then I put just a ever so slight platinum gradient over top of it. But even still at f2.8, look at the fall off. The bokeh in this lens is just beautiful. That's my buddy Howard. He's not long for this world, but I wanted to take a little bit of a portrait of him while he was still around. I do enjoy my wildlife photography, so I wanted to see if I could use this manual focus lens shooting wildlife. Well, guess what? 20 years ago everybody could do it, so there's no reason why we still can't do it now. This was shot at f4. That's straight out of camera. I did not touch anything at all on that image. And I'm going to show you one here that is touched up a little bit, and you can see a slight difference. I did darken the background a little bit, make it pop, the bird pop a little bit, maybe sharpened it, you added a little bit of clarity. But you can definitely use this lens for wildlife. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but you can do it. Now lastly, just so you know, I'm not a channel that's here to try to sell you gear. I like to show you things. I like to offer you some suggestions. Again, I'm a fan of Voigtlander lenses, so I just like talking about them, but I'm not here to sell you Voigtlander lenses. If you do want to see a comparison between this lens and the Nikon 85-1.8, leave a comment and it might encourage me to do that video. I've been thinking about doing it on my own anyway, and maybe even compare it to the 50 F2. Obviously there's a much bigger difference between the 50 F2 and the 85-1.8. However, I do want to find out some comparisons on my own to decide which lenses I want to keep or not keep. Anyway, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please like and subscribe. And if you want to see that video, just leave a comment or shoot me an email and I'll do my best. Till next time, take good care. I'll see you soon.